What's going on with education? What was once a system built to pass on knowledge and critical thinking has been hijacked by ideological crusaders who see the classroom not as a place of learning, but as a vehicle for social transformation. The bureaucratic class calls it equity, and more recently, they call it human rights. But what we're seeing is the enforcement of a worldview, one where everything is filtered through race, gender, and power. The role of the teacher is now to guide students toward social justice rather than objective truth. And it seems questioning any of this makes you the problem. What's worse is how seamlessly this has been built into the system, from teacher colleges to ministry directives, from textbooks to training sessions. The political framework is already in place. Many parents are only just waking up to it. And frankly, they're horrified to learn that their children are being taught to view Canada as a country built on oppression, not through reasoned debate, of course, but as unquestionable moral truth. This is Disrupted. I'm Melanie Bennet. This is my first show, so I just want to take a minute to say what a privilege it is to be joining True North to bring you this show. True North really stand apart in Canada. No government funding, just independent journalism. And if you're watching this show, you probably know how rare that is these days. So it's worth supporting. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Juno News, where you'll find excellent reporting from True North Wire and from the Juno team. Some of you might know me from my other channel, the Canadian Culture Wars Report, where I expose the excesses of woke education and gender ideology with Shannon Boucher. That work continues here, but with an upgrade. Here on Disrupted, I'll be digging into those topics and others shaping our institutions. We'll hear from Canadians pushing back against the authoritarian drift, and we'll dissect the narratives driving culture and politics. My first guest is Stephen Reich. He's a PhD student at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, where he focuses on educational leadership and policy. Before entering academia, Stephen worked as a research lawyer and holds a Bachelor of Laws and a Master of Arts. His current work explores the growing tension between critical theory and cognitive science shaping K-12 education. Stephen has been one of the few voices willing to say plainly what many suspect, that importing American identity politics into Canadian classrooms has done nothing to help students learn and everything to entrench ideology. Stephen's work argues that these frameworks are not only unsupported by evidence, they're actively undermining education. In his recent paper, How Ideology, Not Science, Determined Teaching Children to Read in Ontario, published in the Journal of Controversial Ideas, he lays out a case for why sound, evidence-based instruction, not activist dogma, is the only way to close achievement gaps and actually serve children. Stephen is also a co-chair for Heterodox Academy, an organization that champions open inquiry and genuine intellectual diversity in higher education. He's also my friend. Welcome, Stephen. I'm tickled you're here.
Thanks for having me.
I want to talk about something that you're very passionate about. You've studied critical theory in education, but perhaps many viewers won't really understand the term, or they may not be so familiar with it. I was hoping that you could walk us through what that means and how that ends up shaping what students are taught in school.
Sure. So critical theory has a really long history going back to the 1920s. It's a neo-Marxist investigation of power relationships in society. And so you might ask, well, what does this have to do with education? Well, once it moved across the Atlantic from, its home in Germany into the United States, then it became something that fed some of the scholarship in terms of Black liberation, feminism, queer studies. And this was really taken up by schools of education in terms of their research and in terms of their teaching future teachers. And what it really is it's sort of the abandonment of looking at, what is civilizational knowledge that we expect that all adults should have at 18 after they've gone through a public school system, and what skills will they need based on that knowledge in order to function as functioning adults in society. And instead, it's really directed toward transformational change of society. Now, where question is, well, what is that transformational change? And that's a question that it never answers. And in order to get there, it really looks to saying, well, we have to have this sort of binary division in society between the oppressors and the oppressed. And we're going to say that certain groups in society are the oppressors and certain groups are the oppressed. And we're going to really make education about focusing on how bad the oppressors were, how much the oppressed were victimized, and how we have to raise the voices of the oppressed, and somehow their whole knowledge about their oppression, not their knowledge about anything else, but their knowledge of the oppression is going to guide what education is. And that's where we find ourselves today in Ontario.
So interestingly, this week, there was an announcement from the Ontario Minister of Education talking about some changes in education. But before we get to that, I want to show you a little clip. But before we get to that, in your research, you have specifically talked about American-style politics. I think you've even used that term.
Yep.
And there's some disagreement apparently about what exactly that constitutes. So I thought what we could do is we could watch a little clip from Minister Paul Calandra's announcement this week.
Yeah, look, we'll see. That'll be judged through regulations. But there are examples across the province of Ontario. And again, I hate to keep coming back to the Toronto District School Board, but I said I want politics out of the schools. First and foremost, right? I want trustees. I don't need trustees to develop curriculum. I don't need them to give me advice on global affairs. What I need them to do is put money into classrooms and to our teachers so our students can succeed. When they move away from that mission, I will have the authority under this legislation to put them back on track and ensure that they're focused on their main mission. Student achievement, full stop. And I will not hesitate to step in where I need to step in. I am frankly as done as all parents are and teachers are with a school system that has turned into a political battle zone. Teach our kids, give the parents, the teachers the resources they need, or we will step in and do the job for them.
So that was the clip. But in response to that, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario put out a tweet statement. And they said in that tweet, the Doug Ford government's latest actions are not isolated. They're part of a broader, deliberate effort to Americanize Ontario's public education system. From school board takeovers and merit-based post-secondary policies to disrupting equity initiatives like school renaming, this government is borrowing directly from a Trump-style politic that centralizes power, dismantles public education, and stokes division by supporting populist conservative narratives that turn communities against one another. So I'd be curious, because you've talked about American-style politics and you frame it in a different way. And so who's right?
Well, there's a lot to be said about both statements. Why don't we start with Paul Calandra's statement? I think that Paul Calandra is unacquainted with what his ministry is doing. And I would love to have a meeting with Paul Calandra, and I can show him my research from my MA thesis, where I clocked the ideological bent of all the Ministry of Education productions in terms of curriculum and teacher resource and policy documents from 1980 onward. And even under Doug Ford, the amount of critical theory concepts, equity, diversity, inclusion, and, although those sound wonderful, they're really tied to sort of that same neo-Marxist analysis of society into oppressors and the oppressed, making education about that. The ministry is the one that needs to look right inside their building. The entire curricula that is drafted by them for K-12 education needs a revision. That curricula is exactly a lifting of the American conceptions of, intractable social problems of the United States between the white population and the black population as they, divide it, and as they see it based on their history, perhaps rightly so, that we've imported straight into Canada. We've imported that American narrative straight into Canada without any consideration, other than perhaps adding, Indigenous into the block of the oppressed. So he needs to take a look, forget about the school boards. I mean, the school boards are a creature of statute that, at the stroke of a pen, the government can, and because they're a majority government, they could get rid of school boards altogether. What the school boards do and what's delegated to them ultimately is the responsibility of his ministry. So this is less about the school boards and more about what's going on at the top. I mean, all he has to do is open up any curriculum and spend, a little bit of time reading the first 70 pages, and it'll become very clear to him that the curriculum is establishing that kind of American politics and that kind of grievance politics, and is ignoring content, subject matter, is ignoring what the science says about the best way to teach that subject matter to students. It doesn't inculcate a national identity. It sows division, and that's right in the ministry's own documents. So, if anyone out there has the opportunity to introduce me to Paul Calandra, I would love to meet with him and show him what his ministry is doing before he points the finger at the TDSB. And not to say that what he's saying to the TDSB isn't correct. I agree with him, but the messaging is coming from his ministry. It's coming from up above.
So I want to talk a little bit about your research. You have quantitatively, you did a quantitative analysis comparing the frequency of words that are critical theory words, we'll call them ideological words, within curriculum compared to evidence-based science of learning words within the curriculum. There's supposed to be more science of learning and less ideological material within the ministry's curriculum. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you found?
Sure. So basically, I looked at close to 800 policy documents coming out of the Ministry of Education from about 1982 to 2022. So it was over a 40-year period. And what you see is that exactly at the time that these identity politics were arising in the States, and making their way through ed schools and making their way into policy recommendations in the United States, they were being lifted. And there are scholars who believe in this, who even say that this stuff was just lifted from the American experience, transferred into Canada. So if the United States is doing equity, diversity, inclusion, if they're doing, that school needs to be about social justice and revolution, then we just lifted it into our curriculum. So you see a real spike in the 90s following the riots in LA. And then we had the copycat riots in Toronto in 1993, I believe. So it starts there, and then it sort of declines through the Harris years. And then once Kathleen Wynne is in power, again, we see the rise. And it just keeps building all the way through, and building even more under the Conservative government. So it didn't matter that there was an ideological change in government. The making school about these American-style politics continued onward. And we even see that, in the new elementary school language curriculum, which includes, teaching kids how to read and write, that while, yes, they took the advice of the Ontario Human Rights Commission and, about the science of reading and putting some stuff in there, although really it went into an appendix, the rest of the curriculum doubled down on those ideological politics. That there's even more critical theory language in the new curriculum than there was in the old curriculum. So I really do take
So let me just clarify, if you just mentioned the Right to Read report, the Ontario Human Rights Commission put out a report called the Right to Read report, and it's worth digging into that just a little bit.
Sure.
So in there, I remember reading that the recommendation was to use less they didn't call it social justice. What did they call it?
Socio-cultural focus or socio-cultural concerns, to focus
Right. So
less
they
on that.
advise, but they specifically mentioned culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, which is what the education is based on now, this
Yeah.
socio-cultural pedagogy. But they specifically said that this was leading children to achieve to have lower outcomes, lower achievement, and to stop using it. And you track the curriculums after those recommendations, and what did you find?
Well, and I found that it more than doubled in terms of the critical theory language, or the culturally relevant pedagogy language. And just to be clear, those two systems, like using cognitive science, the science of learning, and what culturally relevant pedagogy demands, they can't be accomplished at the same time. They're completely different, because the science of learning, and this is common sense. So anyone listening to this is going to say, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense to me."
But it's
You
also
have an
evidence
expert?
based. We hear about evidence. Evidence
Well,
based is the science of learning, and then non. They call it not evidence based, but the culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy isn't actually evidence based.
Well, they'll say, "Oh, it is evidence-based because it's based on these studies where we've spoken to 5 teachers and sort of solicited their feelings about white supremacy, for example, and they'll call that evidence." But I'm talking about real quantitative evidence that you can generalize, like done in an experimental or quasi-experimental situation where you have controls, where you actually, there's a pre-test, there's a post-test, you can see whether or not your technique is working. So the problem is that the science of learning really requires an expert who is the focus of the classroom, who is running the classroom, who has a specific method of teaching. We start with phonics, we start with sound correspondences, we do spelling at the same time. It gets more and more complicated. Then once you go through a stage of that, then you're using interesting books, not just any text, but interesting books to then build vocabulary and understanding. Again, using those principles where it's not every kid doing their own thing and discovering how to read, but rather the teacher instructing directly how to do it and keeping track and giving immediate feedback. And then, of course, always having lots of practice, spacing that practice out, because what you want to do is you want to make sure that that sticks into your long-term memory so that you can read automatically. You don't have to expend any working memory energy for reading. Part of the reason why kids don't like to read, and even young adults don't like to read, is it's too effortful, and it's too effortful because they haven't gotten it into their long-term memory to the point where they can have automatic recall. Now, culturally relevant pedagogy is the exact opposite. No hierarchy in the classroom, ideally. Everyone is a co-learner,
Child-centered.
child-centered. Everyone, an assumption, which is a myth, that everyone has a learning style. That's been proven false. There are no such things as learning styles. We learn through all of our senses. We use all of our senses while learning. So you might think that you are a visual learner or an auditory learner, but the fact is you're using all of that. And your brain has different channels for inputting that information into your working memory, where you then build a schemata of what you're learning in your long-term memory. And that's what you need to be doing. So culturally relevant pedagogy doesn't do any of that. It's not concerned with memory. In fact, you'll hear these people saying, "Oh, memorization is drill and kill." And well, you do have to memorize. You have to memorize your multiplication tables. You have to memorize your math facts. You have to memorize the sound correspondences with words. If you want to have any knowledge of history to then be critical about, you're going to have to memorize that too. We use our memories all the time. So to ignore memory and say, the 6-year-old has enough lived experience, whatever that means, I guess, whatever experience they've had in their life, that they can now critically examine the complicated world, is ridiculous. I mean, anyone that
Through
has a
their own
child.
cultural lens, no doubt.
Well, and that also makes an assumption, right? That's saying that based on your skin color, you are X, Y, Z, which is not true because there's so many other factors, right? There's, the biggest one is socioeconomic level. And that's really where sort of this equity-based education system really fails, because it assumes a middle-class orientation, that parents are going to help their kids do their homework, that if the kids have projects, if the parents can't help, they'll hire tutors. Well, that doesn't take into account the kids whose parents don't have those resources or are working 3 jobs and can't sit and do homework with their kids. So when you're asking, children who know pretty much nothing to discover their own knowledge, that's a big ask. And because of that, we see the results. We see the results in PISA scores that where they're declining in reading and math and science. And all the other countries who have adopted that American model are finding the same thing. So, you'll sometimes see, well, Canada's still, we're with the rest of the developed world in terms of our PISA scores. But if you actually look at the rest of the developed world, they're all heading in a downward direction.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of why I take such an interest in education. Obviously, I did have a child that went through education, but it's mostly because K-12 education is the foundation for everybody's future. So it affects everyone, whether or not you have children in school. And what we're doing here is we are imposing pedagogies that are not actually helping the future thrive. So it is a concern for everyone, because if people are not functional in the future, perhaps you won't have a pension to rely on. There's all these interconnecting factors with education. But I don't want to end up blackpilling everyone, because it can be like that in education, to be sure. I was wondering if you perhaps had any suggestions of what either parents or other people could do to try to raise the alarm or do something about it, especially at this time when it appears that Ontario's Minister of Education perhaps has an ear towards listening.
Well, I think parent groups and individual parents should write to the minister and say that the reform that the ministry has to do is to reorient education around knowledge and the pedagogy that we know works because it's been experimentally tested, and we've known about this for 50 or more years. That science is only getting more exact. But the outlines of it we've known for a long time. It in fact is common sense. I think those parents can write to them. And parents can have conversations with teachers. Now, some teachers have swallowed the Kool-Aid, and you're never going to move them. But I find, when I speak at events, I find that the upper echelons of the ed schools, the professors in faculties of education are very hostile toward my ideas. But the students themselves in the ed schools, the teachers themselves, the students themselves, and the parents are very receptive, because it's quite simple. Like, we just have to have a knowledge-based curriculum, and we have to teach teachers how to teach that curriculum in the most efficient and fair way. And so write to your minister, speak to your teachers, speak to other parents, put together groups where you write to the minister. If you like what I'm saying, I'd be happy to come and speak to your group. I'd be happy to, put myself out as someone who could speak to the minister. There are other people that I know who are also very concerned about the direction of education. We can help. So I think that's what people can do. I'm eternally an optimist that I think that at some point, there is sort of a reaction. We're seeing a little bit of a reaction in the States now. Unfortunately, when the pendulum swings too far one way, then it swings too far the other way. And I think that what we see in the United States with Trump and some of the more authoritarian things that are going on there in terms of government is the reaction to what was going on before. I think that if we try and seek agreement about what are the goals of society, and I think everyone pretty much agrees that we would like a knowledgeable society where people care about their country and one another. I think the majority of people care about that, and they care that, whether you come from a poor home, a middle class home, a rich home, that you deserve a quality education and the chance to prove your talents. It's not going to result in equal outcomes, because some people are smarter, some people are more talented, et cetera, et cetera. But at least it will make everyone have mastery over a body of knowledge that is going to serve them well, not only for themselves as adults, but also for this country. And, we got a big shock with Trump's 51st state thing. Like suddenly after, years of, not liking Canada and not being proud of Canada, suddenly everyone became patriotic. Well, we have to make something of that. What actually ties us together? What is the history that ties us together with its warts and all? But a history that we can be proud of for the most part and say that we continue to improve. We have to care about our fellow citizens. We have to unleash innovation if we want Canada, not reliant and just sort of a branch plant of the United States. We want to create our own jobs, our own industries here. Then people have to care about this country. And if all we do is put down every system and everyone who existed in this system at every time and use presentism, the idea that we're going to morally judge people in the past by present standards, well, that's not critical thinking. That's easy. Critical thinking is when you can place yourself back in that era of history and judge them by, what did people know back then? That's much more critical and much more interesting than judging them by today's standards, which we might find 10 years from now that we're judging today's standards.
Yeah. So we're coming to the end of the time that we have today, but you mentioned if people wanted to get a hold of you, because you quite happily go meet with people and do talks and all sorts of things like that. So how would they get in touch with you if they so chose?
Well, I suppose that they could do it through you. Your listeners could do it through you. I will give you my email address, and feel free if you're able to, put it on the screen for your viewers. It's sfreich, Reich, at outlook.com. So again, that's sfreich at outlook.com. And I will certainly answer you. And as I said, I think the clue I would sit down at a table with anyone, even someone who is diametrically opposed to the ideas that I have, to have a discussion. And I think that that's how we start. And we have to start speaking honestly and fearlessly. And I say fearlessly in terms of don't worry about, being slammed that you're retrograde or you're conservative, if that's a bad word, or right wing or whatever, just because you have some questions. I think people, have to pull on their adult panties and be willing to face people that get angry with them, but to respond in a calm, rational way to talk about what the real concerns are. And I think that that's the way forward.
Okay, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to reading your whatever upcoming research that you have going on.
Well, my next big project for my PhD is going to be what future teachers are learning in ed schools. So that should be interesting. Again, tied to, are they learning critical theory? Are they learning, the subject matters of what they will one day will be teaching? And are they learning science-based or ideological-based methods of transferring that knowledge to children?
Oh, well, I look forward to it. All right. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.